St. Michael's Hospital in Savannah hums with fluorescent lights and the antiseptic bite of disinfectant at 2 a.m. Margaret Walsh moves through the ICU with economy of motion, checking vitals, adjusting for drips, her movements precise in a way that suggests discipline rather than routine. She wears scrubs 2 sizes too large and keeps her dark hair pulled back tight. A slight limp favors her left leg. Nobody notices. Nobody asks. In her locker hangs a worn jacket with something sewn into the lining, a faded unit patch from the 75th Ranger Regiment, the words Crossfire stitched beneath it in silver thread she touches once before each shift, the way other people touch crucifixes. Her hands don't shake when she inserts central lines, even though the newer nurses always need 2 attempts. Tonight she is 53 minutes into her shift when the ambulance radio crackles through the PA system. The dispatcher's voice is flat, administrative. Incoming trauma, ETA for minutes, 47-year-old male with complex medical history, multiple surgeries related to Baghdad blast injuries, complications from embedded shrapnel fragments, hearing loss documented, nonverbal patient, communication barriers present. Margaret's jaw tightens by approximately 1 millimeter. She hears it before anyone else does, the specific cadence of a ranger who survived something that was supposed to kill him. 8 months ago she had volunteered for night shift nursing at St. Michael's, not because she needed the salary but because the Veterans Affairs fraud ring connected to this hospital had been running phantom billing codes through ICU overnight monitoring for nearly 3 years, stealing $847,000 from soldiers who couldn't afford to sue. The Pentagon had called her at 6:44 a.m. on a Tuesday. Not a request. It was a command. So Margaret had put away her captain's bars, her combat citations, her entire military identity, and walked into St. Michael's wearing second-hand scrubs and a voice 2 octaves softer than her natural register. She had been waiting for a patient like this. The ambulance arrives at 2:54 a.m. The ranger is wheeled into Trauma Bay 3 with both earpieces removed, his left arm bandaged from shoulder to wrist, his chart stamped with red alert flags regarding resource allocation and standard protocols. He cannot hear. He can sign. Margaret watches from the observation window, professional distance, as the receiving nurse, Trevor, enthusiastic, brand new, attempts to explain procedures through written note cards. The ranger's eyes are the color of storm-flat Atlantic water. He reads lips. He nods. He is trying very hard to make this easy for people who are already deciding he is too much trouble. Dr. Pierce arrives for early rounds at 6:15 a.m. Friday morning, expensive watch catching the light like a warning, already scrolling through his phone with the distracted authority of someone who owns every room he enters. He is tall, lean, the kind of handsome that photographs well in hospital administration brochures. His white coat fits expensive shoulders. His voice, when he speaks, sounds like a tank idling in a garage, low, contained, supremely confident. He does not read the full chart. He reads the flags. Margaret stands 3 feet behind him at the nursing station, pretending to input vital signs on the computer. She is very good at pretending. Who authorized this admission? Pierce asks Trevor, not looking up from the iPad. Emergency services. Direct ambulance from airport medical transport. Shrapnel complications from combat injuries. 2001, that's 23 years of chronic care with an embedded foreign body that nobody has successfully removed. Communication barriers. Pierce finally looks at the chart. He does not look at the ranger's face, which is visible through the trauma bay window 40 feet away. Resource allocation and communication complexity make this case unsuitable for standard ICU protocol. We don't have speech-to-text infrastructure. We don't have sign language interpreters on payroll at night. He hands the iPad back. To Trevor. Tell them the hospital cannot accommodate his needs. Recommend VAMC or Savannah Regional. Someone else's problem. The tone isn't cruel. That's what makes it worse. It's bureaucratic. It's efficient. It's the voice of a man who has never been anyone's problem and therefore assumes everyone else is simply poor at managing themselves. Margaret continues entering data. Her hands are steady. The limp is more pronounced when she walks, a calculated detail, as she exits the nursing station toward the medication room. She closes the door. She does not cry. She does not tremble. Instead, she thinks about the 47-year-old ranger in Trauma Bay 3 who survived IED blast fragmentation that killed 3 soldiers in his convoy, who trained her on field thoracotomy technique with a combat knife when she rotated into his unit in 2002, who taught for enlisted medics including her how to read tension pneumothorax by the sound of breath and the color of lips. She thinks about what he was before Baghdad. What he is now. What the Pentagon told her on a Tuesday morning would happen if she could not stop the fraud ring stealing from men like him. At 9:41 a.m., a second doctor is consulted. Dr. Reeves, surgical specialty, reads the chart and the flags and delivers his opinion in the hallway where the ranger cannot see, cannot read, cannot argue. We're not equipped for this level of complexity. The communication barriers alone create liability. He needs specialized care. Not here. At 11:45 a.m., a third doctor, Dr. Hassan from neurology, examines the ranger's scans and then steps into the hallway. Shrapnel at this depth. Attempted removal could cause permanent hearing loss in the remaining ear. The risk-benefit ratio is unfavorable. I cannot recommend surgical intervention. He does not say he is refusing the case. He just does not take it. At 1:20 p.m. Friday, a fourth doctor. Then a fifth at 3:48 p.m. Then a sixth at 5:15 p.m. Each refusal is polite. Each is professionally justified. Each leaves the ranger lying in Trauma Bay 3 with his vitals stable but his chart stamped red and his future increasingly narrow. Margaret maintains her composure through all of it. She checks his flow. She adjusts his bed height. She brings him water through a flexible straw because his right arm cannot reach. She does not speak more than necessary. She does not reveal her awareness. This is her job. This is the cover. This is what 8 months of undercover work has taught her about patience. But something in the air shifts at 2:24 a.m. Saturday when the 7th doctor arrives. His name is Dr. Klein, infectious disease specialist, and he enters the trauma bay with the casual authority of someone who has never been taught the concept of refusal. He reads the ranger's chart. He examines the wound sites. He steps into the hallway and delivers the final objection. Complex presentation. Resource-intensive. Limited evidence of successful outcomes in similar cases. I recommend palliative care and comfort measures pending family consultation. Palliative care. Margaret understands the medical euphemism perfectly. She has not been a captain for 8 months. She has been a night shift nurse watching the institution slowly decide that this ranger is not worth saving. 7 doctors. 7 refusals. 0 alternatives offered. The hospital does not have the infrastructure. The hospital does not have the expertise. The hospital does not have the will. But Margaret Walsh, lying dormant inside a second-hand scrubs uniform, has both. She approaches the ranger's bedside at 3:12 a.m., when the hospital quiets to the sound of ventilators and the distant hum of the ice machine in the break room. She does not speak. She begins checking his vitals again, her hands reading his tension pneumothorax the way they have read a dozen others in field hospitals where hesitation meant body bags. Her touch is diagnostic. Her silence is communication. The ranger's storm-flat eyes meet hers, and for exactly 3 seconds, the entire weight of 8 months sits between them. She does not blink. She does not flinch. She simply begins the work of saving him. 1 foredrip, 1 vital sign, 1 act of quiet defiance at a time. Nobody knows yet who she is. Nobody knows what she can do. Nobody knows that the woman they have been dismissing as just a nurse has already survived worse than everything they are about to face. Thursday morning in the Grand Rounds Amphitheatre. The smell of antiseptic mingled with stale coffee as 30 residents and attendings settled into tiered seating, their laptops open, their expression somewhere between engaged and checking their phones. Dr. Pierce stood at the lectern with the posture of a man who owned the room, shoulders back, chin elevated, the kind of bearing that came not from confidence but from the certainty that no one would challenge him. Margaret stood against the back wall in her scrubs, a cardboard clipboard tucked under one arm, watching the presentation with the calm intensity of someone taking an inventory of exits. The case was cardiac. 73-year-old veteran, post-MI, ejection fraction at 28%, admitted Tuesday for monitoring. Margaret had flagged the overnight charges during her Tuesday night rounds, $742 billed for continuous cardiology monitoring between 2 a.m. and 6 a.m. on a floor where no cardiologist had set foot. She'd pulled the logs herself, reviewed the timestamps, checked the staffing schedule. The monitoring never happened. The charge did. Pierce clicked to a new slide. Patient responded well to standard post-MI protocol. Discharged yesterday after 72 hours of appropriate in-hospital observation. He paused, and his eyes found Margaret against the back wall. Not accidentally. Deliberately. The way a predator locates movement in tall grass. Though I should note that not all staff members understand the distinction between appropriate clinical observation and, shall we say, creative interpretation of overnight monitoring protocols. The room shifted. 30 heads turned to look at her. Nurse Walsh here flagged what she called, and I quote, discrepancies in overnight monitoring charges. Perhaps our Nightingale can explain to everyone why she's questioning attending-level billing decisions when she can barely read updated Medicare guidelines. He let the sentence hang in the air like smoke. Someone made a sound that might have been laughter or might have been a cough. Then another. Then a third. The residents exchanged glances. One of them, a thin man with red-rimmed eyes, actually grinned. Margaret's face didn't change. Not a flicker. Not a flush. Not a tremor in her jaw. She stood absolutely still against the wall, her posture unchanged, her breathing unchanged, and that absence of reaction, that refusal to give Pierce the satisfaction of seeing her break, seemed to make him angrier than if she'd cried. Moving on, Pierce said, but his voice had lost some of its smooth edge. He clicked through 3 more cases with diminished enthusiasm, clearly annoyed that his humiliation hadn't landed the way he'd expected. The presentation ended. The residents filed out. Someone muttered Nightingale again by the vending machines as Margaret passed, and 2 interns elbow-checked each other as if they'd just witnessed comedy gold. Margaret kept walking. Her hands were steady. Her pulse was steady. The trembling that Pierce might have expected, that most people expected from someone publicly ridiculed in front of 30 colleagues, never came. She was the eye of a hurricane he couldn't see. But that wasn't the worst part. It was afternoon when Pierce cornered her in the medication room. She was pulling night shift supplies, checking stock on morphine syringes and 4 lines, when his shadow fell across the doorway. The room was maybe 8 feet wide, lined with white shelving and the sharp chemical smell of compounded medications. There was nowhere to go except through him. Your triage protocols are outdated, Walsh, he said, and his voice carried out into the hallway where 2 pharmacy techs and 3 nurses could hear every word. You're operating on whatever backwater training you limped in here with. Maybe community college prepared you for bedpans, but this is a teaching hospital. He stepped closer. His breath smelled like the energy drink he'd been nursing, something synthetic and chemical. You don't belong here. Margaret turned to face him. Slowly. Deliberately. She was maybe 5'7", 135 pounds, and in that moment she seemed to expand until she filled the entire room. Her eyes were the color of winter storm clouds over the Atlantic, and when she spoke, her voice came out like a blade sliding from a sheath, smooth and quiet and absolutely lethal. Interesting that you're auditing my competence the same week I documented those ghost charges. $742 for monitoring that never happened. Tuesday night, 2 to 6 a.m. I have the screenshots. The staffing logs. The cardiac status reports that show no physician contact during that window. She stepped forward, and Pierce stepped back. That was when Margaret knew she'd won. I'd lawyer up if I were you, doctor. She turned and walked past him into the hallway. Behind her, she heard the sound of his hands clenching. She heard the sharp intake of breath. She did not look back. The pharmacy techs suddenly became very interested in their compounding work. One of the nurses bent over a supply cart with sudden intensity. The message had been received. The threat had landed. And Margaret Walsh, who had spent the last 8 months moving through this hospital like a ghost, had just announced that she saw things. That she documented things. That she wasn't going away quietly. Pierce tried to regain control through channels. He called the hospital administrator that evening and left a voicemail about concerning billing protocol questions from nursing staff. He sent an email to Margaret's original nursing school references asking about patterns of insubordination and questions about competence verification. He activated his network, the invisible web of physician loyalty that had kept him protected for 6 years, a word here, a favor there, a dinner in the right ear. By Friday morning, the machinery was in motion. It was 7:48 a.m. when 2 security officers appeared at the nurses' station. They were professional about it. Quiet. One of them, an older woman named Garcia with kind eyes, actually looked uncomfortable. "Ms. Walsh, we need you to come with us for preliminary discussions about protocol compliance," the male officer said. It wasn't a request. His hand wasn't near his belt, but the implied authority was clear. Administrative wing. Dr. Pierce has requested a preliminary review. The room went dead silent. Monitors beeped. Ventilators wheezed. And 4 pump alarmed softly in one of the patient rooms, but the nurse's station itself had become an island of absolute quiet. Margaret set down her medication cart. She glanced at the 3 nurses she'd been working with, all of them suddenly very focused on their screens, their charts, anything that didn't involve direct eye contact. She stood up, straightened her scrubs, touched the pocket where her unit patch was sewn inside the jacket lining, a faded 75th Ranger Regiment insignia, the one piece of her identity she'd hidden under layers of cardigans and professionalism. Her hands were steady. Her voice was level. "Of course," she said to Garcia. "Lead the way." As she walked past the nurse's station, she made eye contact with each woman. The message was clear in that single glance. I knew this was coming. I'm not worried. And that wasn't bravado, it was the pure, undeniable calm of someone who had already survived far worse than an administrative investigation. She'd survived Baghdad. She'd survived 17 field surgeries under fire. She'd survived the kind of chaos that turned most people into ambulatory trauma. An HR investigation wasn't a crisis. It was a minor administrative inconvenience. Pierce watched from his office as she passed, escorted by security down the hallway toward the administrative wing. His expression was satisfied. Triumphant. He thought he was winning. He had no idea what he'd just triggered. That afternoon, a deaf Army Ranger arrived via ambulance from the VA hospital. His name was on the admission board as a surgical consult with complications from retained shrapnel fragments in his left thorax, sustained 18 months prior in Baghdad during IED detonation. His sister, a Marine Corps liaison officer with captain's bars and eyes that had seen the same wars Margaret had, explained through an interpreter that the infection around the metal fragments had begun tracking toward the left lung. The ranger's hands moved in ASL with precision and speed, muscular memory of someone who had spent years communicating with his unit before the explosion took his hearing. Margaret, processing her suspension through a grey hospital phone in the security office, didn't know yet. But the machinery was turning. The patient she'd been sent here to protect had finally arrived. And Margaret Walsh was about to be fired for saving him. Sunday morning at 6:51 a.m., the heart monitor started screaming. Margaret didn't look up from the medication cart until the rhythm changed, a wild spike from 82 to 142, the kind of elevation that meant something had just broken inside the ranger's chest. She moved toward room 347 before the alarm finished its first wail, muscle memory pulling her legs faster than thought could catch up. The oxygen saturation number flickered on the central monitor, 94. Then 91. Then 88. Dropping like a stone thrown into dark water. She reached his bedside and pressed 2 fingers against his neck. The carotid pulse hammered against her fingertips with the frantic panic of a trapped animal. His lips were already taking on that bluish tint, the color that meant oxygen wasn't reaching where it needed to go. Margaret's eye scanned the monitor again, blood pressure 76/42 and falling, the kind of numbers that left a window of maybe 4 minutes before his heart gave up entirely. She'd seen this pattern before. She knew exactly what was killing him from the inside. Tension pneumothorax. The shrapnel wound from Baghdad had scarred, and something had just ruptured. Air was escaping into the space between his lung and chest wall, collapsing the lung, pushing his heart sideways, crushing every system that depended on filling and emptying in an orderly rhythm. A simple concept. A fatal one. Margaret keyed the overhead page with the kind of calm that only comes from having already survived worse. Code Blue, room 347. Any attending physician, Code Blue, room 347. She released the button and watched the monitor. The oxygen was already at 82. She waited 3 seconds. 5. 10. The overhead stayed silent. No footsteps in the hallway. No one running toward the sound of a dying patient. She paged again. Dr. Pierce, this is the night shift. We need you in 347. Vitals are crashing. Nothing. The monitor beeped its mechanical indifference, each sound a heartbeat closer to a flat line. Margaret had worked here for 8 months. She knew the shift change protocols, knew that most of the day team wasn't even in the building yet, knew that the on-call physician who was supposed to cover emergencies between night and day shift was. She'd watched him leave the hospital 45 minutes ago through the main entrance, car keys already in his hand. The ranger's oxygen dropped to 78. She moved toward the supply cabinet without calling for help again. There was no help coming. She'd learned that lesson the day 7 doctors had read his chart and walked away one after another, each finding a different reason to refuse him. Communication barrier. Resource allocation. Staffing ratios. Complex trauma history. The excuses had worn different names but carried the same message: not our problem. Let someone else decide. Someone else wasn't here now. Margaret's hands worked with the fluid precision of muscle memory, movements learned in a field hospital outside Fallujah where the electricity ran on generators and the morphine bottles were counted down to the last drop. She grabbed the trauma shears from the crash cart and cut his shirt open with 4 decisive snips, the scissors making that sharp metallic whisper against fabric. The scar tissue from the shrapnel wound was visible across his upper left chest, a mess of pink and purple that told the story of a body that had already been broken once and somehow still functioned. She palpated the second intercostal space, finding the landmarks with her fingertips, the ridge of the second rib, the hollow between the second and third, the midclavicular line where a needle would have the clearest path. The ranger's eyes were open, tracking her movements, still aware even as the oxygen dropped to 74. She held his gaze for 1 second. Long enough for him to understand that someone was still fighting. That he wasn't dying alone in this room. "I've got you," she said, and her voice sounded like it came from somewhere very far away and very long ago. "Stay with me." She didn't ask for permission. She didn't call for a supervising physician. She didn't wait for authorization that would never come. She prepped the site with betadine, and the antiseptic smell cut through the stale hospital air like a blade. The 14-gauge needle was already in her hand. She'd known the moment she saw his vitals that waiting would be fatal. The needle went in at an angle, perpendicular to his chest wall, pushing through skin and muscle and fascia until it found the pocket of air that shouldn't have been there. The hiss came immediately. It was the sound of air escaping under pressure, the sound of a system rebalancing, the sound of a man getting a second chance. Margaret's left hand was steady on the needle as her right hand held his shoulder, keeping him from moving, keeping the trajectory true. His oxygen saturation flickered on the monitor, 76. 78, 81. Climbing back toward the land of the living with every second the needle remained in place. 84, 87. 90. She kept the needle angled, her thumb and forefinger holding it steady as the cascade of released air continued. The pneumothorax was massive, She could feel it by the way the air kept coming, a small wind escaping from inside his body. His heart rate began to slow, dropping from 142 toward the high 90s. His blood pressure started to climb. Numbers returning to numbers that meant survival instead of countdown. Margaret secured the needle with tape, standard protocol, a temporary measure that would keep it in place until someone with actual authority could convert this to a proper chest tube in the ICU. The whole procedure had taken 47 seconds. The ranger's oxygen saturation settled at 94. His lips were already losing that blue tint, color returning like a Polaroid slowly developing in reverse. His eyes met hers again, and something passed between them that didn't need words. Recognition. History. The knowledge that they had stood in the same burning places and made the same choices and survived things that should have killed them dead. Sinus rhythm, she said, reading the monitor. You're stable now. She was washing her hands at the sink, the smell of hospital soap rising up like some kind of benediction, when the footsteps finally came. Dr. Garrison from the day shift pushed into the room, confusion registering on his face when he saw the secured needle, the cut-open shirt, the monitor displaying vitals that looked almost normal. What happened? He asked, but he was already reading the patient report Margaret had begun documenting while the ranger's body was stabilizing. Tension pneumothorax. Emergency needle decompression. Immediate stabilization. You're good, Margaret said, and stepped back from the bedside. He'll need a chest tube, proper imaging, the whole workup. But right now he's breathing. Garrison nodded, understanding the implied weight beneath those words. A patient abandoned by 7 physicians. A window where no one was coming. A nurse who'd made a choice. She was back at the medication cart when the first phone call came through the hospital phone system. Not a page. A direct call to the nursing station. She knew before she answered who it would be. She'd felt the shift in the air, the moment when something had broken in ways that couldn't be fixed with a needle and antiseptic. Is this Margaret Walsh? The voice was administrative, cold, the kind of tone that came from someone reading off a script they'd already practiced. Speaking, she said. Human Resources needs to see you in the office. Immediately. This is regarding unauthorized procedures and scope of practice violations. The line went dead before she could respond. Through the glass walls of the nursing station, Margaret could see Dr. Pierce in the physician's lounge. He was pacing, his phone pressed against his ear, his free hand moving with agitation as he spoke to whoever was on the other end. She watched him for 7 full seconds, watched his expression shift from anger to something that looked almost like desperation, the kind of look that came when a plan started to unravel in ways that couldn't be controlled. He glanced toward the nursing station once, and their eyes met across the distance. His jaw tightened. Margaret turned back to her cart and continued organizing medication, her hands moving with the same precision they'd used on the ranger's chest. She had maybe 15 minutes before HR would call again, maybe 30 before security arrived to escort her out. She didn't tremor. She didn't rush. She moved like someone who had already calculated the cost and decided it was worth paying. By the time she walked into the Human Resources office on the 3rd floor, Dr. Pierce had already made 4 phone calls. She would learn later, much later, that he'd called the hospital board president during what was probably the man's Sunday morning golf game. That he'd called a state senator whose daughter had been treated for a staph infection at St. Michael's 5 years ago. That he'd called the nursing school where Margaret had earned her credentials, and left a message about concerning patterns of insubordination and potential medication discrepancies that warranted investigation. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was what he did after those 4 calls failed to produce the immediate termination he needed. The worst part was how competent Dr. Pierce was at wielding institutional power like a weapon, and how thoroughly he had underestimated the woman standing in room 347 with a needle and a conscience. By noon, Margaret's security badge had been deactivated. By 1 p.m., her locker was being cleared by someone from HR while she watched, holding a cardboard box that HR had provided. The box smelled like storage and neutrality. She placed her personal items inside it with the same careful movement she'd used to save a life that morning: her badge, her pen, a sweater, a photograph of her unit outside Fallujah, the faded unit patch she'd kept sewn inside her jacket lining, the 75th Ranger Regiment insignia with crossfire stitched beneath it, the call sign that now rested in a cardboard box instead of against her chest. She had saved the Ranger's life at 6:53 a.m. on a Sunday morning when the entire system had failed him. By 1:06 p.m., the system had begun its revenge. Monday morning hit like a fist through water. Dr. Pierce sat in the yacht club dining room, fingers wrapped around a crystal tumbler of 18-year-old Macallan, watching the Savannah River move past the windows like time made liquid. His phone was already in his hand. First call, the hospital board president, mid-scrambled egg, mid-conversation about tax strategies. "We have a nurse. Margaret Walsh. I'm seeing patterns in her patient interactions that concern me deeply. Insubordination. Unauthorized procedures. I'd hate for this to become a liability issue." The board president knew how to read between syllables. Pierce had contributed $40,000 to the hospital's foundation last fiscal year. $40,000 purchased access. Purchased the kind of concern that moved quickly. Second call came at 9:17. Pierce's contact at Savannah Medical University, the dean of nursing, voice pitched low and friendly. "Margaret Walsh. She was your graduate, class of 2016. The dean confirmed. Pierce paused, the pause the length of a held breath, the pause that makes people fill silence with worry. "I'm not making any accusations. Just noting some concerning patterns in her documentation. Perhaps a fitness review? I assume you keep in touch with your graduates." The dean said he'd make some calls. People made calls. That's what people did when someone with $40,000 suggested they might. By 10 o'clock, Pierce had activated his network like a man flipping switches in a power plant. A compliance investigator, external, federal-looking, carrying the kind of clipboard that made people confess things they hadn't done, was already in the hospital, already requesting Margaret's patient interactions logs, already photographing her medication dispensing records. The investigator wore wire-rimmed glasses and the expression of someone solving a puzzle nobody else could see. He didn't know he was a weapon. He just knew his job was auditing. Margaret's badge stopped working at 12:43 p.m. She was in the break room, sitting with a half-eaten sandwich she couldn't taste, when HR arrived with security. Two people, one of them carrying a manila folder, the other carrying body language that said this wasn't a conversation, this was a procedure. "Captain Walsh," the folder holder began, but caught himself, course-corrected. "Ms. Walsh. We need you to come with us." She stood. She didn't ask questions. She never asked questions. That was lesson 1 of living undercover: curiosity gets you killed, uncertainty kills everyone else. Her locker was emptied in front of her. The contents distributed into a cardboard box by an HR associate named Derek who wouldn't make eye contact. Scrubs folded. A protein bar she'd forgotten about since March. A copy of the American Journal of Critical Care Medicine with a highlighted article on femoral cannulation. A photograph, one she kept hidden because photographs are evidence, of her Ranger unit outside Fallujah in 2009, 12 faces arranged in front of a concrete wall, faces that had names and names that now had stones in Arlington Cemetery with weather on them. Derek set the box on the table. "You can take personal items. Work-related materials stay here pending the investigation review." The box weighed almost nothing. That was the strangest part. Everything she'd been, 8 months of pretending to be less, 8 months of swallowing insults and absorbing humiliation like a trauma dressing absorbs blood, 8 months of being placed at St. Michael's by the Pentagon to catalog the pattern of inflated charges on veteran ICU stays, fit into a box you could carry in one hand. The chipped mug that read "World's Okayest Nurse" was hers though. She'd bought it at a Target in the medical district. Derek didn't stop her. The half-dead succulent with leaves the color of rust, hers. The photograph, hers. She placed them carefully into the box. Her hands moved like she was packing something that would never reach its destination. Outside, Savannah had turned the sky the color of hospital walls. Rain had arrived sometime between the compliance investigator's third audit request and her badge deactivation. The kind of rain that didn't fall so much as accumulate, that turned the streets into mirrors reflecting nothing good. She stood at the bus stop 3 blocks from St. Michael's because going home felt like going backward and there was nowhere else to move forward to. The cardboard box bottom was already softening. She shifted it to her hip. The succulent tilted, almost fell, didn't. A car passed. A BMW, expensive enough to have clean windows. The driver was a man in a suit, the kind of suit that cost what she made in 3 months. He didn't see her. People didn't see people holding cardboard boxes in the rain. People saw through them. Her phone buzzed. Text from an encrypted number she'd memorized 8 months ago, extraction team en route. Mission compromised. Report to debrief location. She didn't respond. She just stood there, water moving down her face in paths that might have been rain or might have been something else, thinking about a deaf ranger in room 347, thinking about the moment his pressure dropped and nobody came, thinking about how she'd moved through the ICU like muscle memory was rebellion, like 30 seconds of knowing exactly where to place a needle and how hard to push was the difference between a body and a life. Thinking about how she'd saved him. Thinking about what it cost. The bus stop bench had a puddle reflecting a traffic light. She didn't sit. Inside St. Michael's, Dr. Pierce was already moving. He'd texted 2 state representatives, both of whom had campaign debts. He'd scheduled a call with the nursing board's executive director. He'd arranged for Margaret's original hiring file to be flagged for credential review. He'd set every institutional mechanism spinning in the direction of erasure. What he didn't know, what he couldn't possibly know, was that the man in room 347 had regained consciousness at 11:49 that morning, that he'd been moving his hands, that he'd been signing one word over and over, that the word was her call sign, the word was crossfire. What he didn't know was that a Marine liaison officer was already on her way to the hospital, that she was bringing documents that Pierce couldn't weaponize, that she was carrying a unit patch with thread worn thin from a dead man's hand, a patch stitched with the 75th Ranger Regiment insignia and the call sign that meant Margaret had done this before, meant Margaret had done worse than this, meant Margaret had trained the man he was trying to destroy. What he didn't know was that extraction teams moved in the military the way cardiac arrests moved in hospitals, fast, organized, purposeful, and that the team rolling toward Savannah from Fort Moore Henry wasn't coming to extract Margaret at all. Margaret shifted the box again, feeling the weight of 8 months of surveillance data she'd hidden in her apartment, 8 months of photograph billing records and time-stamped evidence, 8 months of proving that the pattern Pierce was enforcing was a pattern he'd built, brick by fraudulent brick. The rain kept falling. She kept waiting. The bus that arrived at 12:54 wasn't the bus she needed. She didn't board it. The bus that arrived at 12:54 wasn't the bus she needed. She didn't board it. Instead, she stood under the awning of a closed pharmacy across from St. Michael's, watching the rain hammer the parking lot in sheets, and waited for the next text. It came at 12:58. Not from her commanding officer. From Captain James Holloway, the Ranger's sister. A Marine Corps liaison officer with a clearance higher than the hospital administrators. Margaret didn't move. 12:58 a.m. on a Tuesday meant the hospital ethics board convened at 9 a.m. sharp. That meant Dr. Pierce was in that conference room right now, presenting his meticulously constructed case against her. Insubordination. Pattern of recklessness. Potential endangerment of patients. She could see him, throat clear, voice measured, the kind of practiced sincerity that convinced board members to revoke licenses. He'd made calls. She knew he'd made calls. The compliance investigator brought in from Atlanta. The phone tree of colleagues he'd activated. The 3 phone calls to her nursing school references, each one seeding doubt like poison in good soil. But the Ranger was awake. Margaret walked back into St. Michael's at 1:03 a.m. through the emergency entrance, her cardboard box still in her car, her badge deactivated, her clearance stripped. She moved like someone who still belonged there, her shoulders back, head level, the kind of invisible authority that made security cameras swivel away from her face. A visitor. That's all anyone would see. Just another visitor at an ungodly hour, the kind hospitals expected on Tuesday mornings when families got the call. The elevator hummed its mechanical breath. 4th floor. The ranger's room sat at the end of the critical care wing, the same wing where 7 different doctors had read his intake file and found reasons to decline. Resource allocation. Communication barriers. Existing comorbidities. Complex case requiring specialists outside current scope. Each refusal had come with the same apologetic tone, the same institutional language that turned a human being into a scheduling problem. 7 refusals. That specific number had burned into her memory like a brand. Room 347. The ranger lay with his eyes open, color returning to his face like someone remembering how to live. No chest tube anymore. The infection markers dropping. His sister sat in the visitor's chair, marine dress uniform pressed sharp as a knife blade, lieutenant colonel rank on her shoulders, the kind of bearing that told Margaret this woman had spent her career fixing problems that civilians didn't know existed. The sister stood when Margaret entered. Saluted without a word. That single gesture, fist to chest, eyes forward, told Margaret everything she needed to know. The sister knew. Somehow, she already knew. Captain. The word hung in the air like a challenge. Your name is not Margaret Walsh. Or it is, but that's not all you are. The ranger signed something rapid, his hand still recovering from the infection, but his meaning was unmistakable. She saved me. She saved me twice. Margaret pulled up a chair beside the bed. She didn't acknowledge the sister's statement. Not yet. Instead, she looked at the ranger, really looked at him, and let her eyes hold his for 3 full seconds. How's the pain? Manageable. His voice came out rough, underused. The infection had stolen a week of speech from him. Your hands moved like you'd done this before. I had. Margaret's tone was flat. Military. The composure style that had carried her through 8 months of playing a retiring night shift nurse. Baghdad. 2009, you were there. The ranger's hands trembled slightly as he signed to his sister. The sister's eyes widened. She pulled out her phone and made a call, 1 word, General. Then she stepped into the hallway. Margaret waited in the silence that followed. The hospital at 1:15 a.m. sounded different. The ventilators wheezed their mechanical rhythm. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead like insects trapped in fluorescent tombs. Somewhere down the corridor, a monitor beeped steadily, the sound of a heartbeat proving its point to an indifferent universe. Why didn't you tell them? The ranger asked. His voice had gained strength already, the kind of recovery that came from wanting to live for a specific reason. Because I wasn't here as a captain. Margaret's hands folded in her lap. I was here to find out why 7 doctors refused to treat a deaf veteran with complications from service-connected injuries. I was here to trace the billing fraud that targets soldiers whose advocates are too tired to fight. You being treated was secondary to the investigation. Was. He smiled, the first smile she'd seen from him. Past tense. The door to the conference room was 2 floors down, east corridor, past the surgical nursing station. Dr. Pierce stood at the head of the mahogany table, his presentation open on the screen behind him, 6 slides documenting Margaret Walsh's various failures, insubordinations, and concerning patterns. The hospital board president sat with his coffee growing cold, the compliance investigator had her notebook open, and 3 other board members had their arms crossed in that particular posture of people preparing to make decisions that would end careers. As you can see, Pierce was saying, his voice like a tank idling in a garage, low, dangerous, contained, this pattern didn't emerge overnight. The documentation discrepancies I mentioned are only the surface. What concerns me is what they might indicate about her judgment overall, particularly with vulnerable populations. The board president nodded, making a note. Pierce had built his case like a surgical team builds a case in the OR, methodical, with each piece positioned to support the weight of the verdict. He'd called 3 colleagues. He'd activated the compliance investigator. He'd made certain that Margaret's security clearance for night shift nursing was revoked before she could access the personnel files that would prove his billing codes were phantom. What he hadn't anticipated was the Ranger's sister. Captain James Holloway walked into the conference room at 1:21 a.m., still in dress uniform, and without saying a word, placed the faded unit patch on the mahogany table. 75th Ranger Regiment insignia. Crossfire stitched beneath it in thread that had survived 8 months of being sewn into the lining of a jacket. That patch, Holloway said, her voice like gravel under a boot heel, was clutched in my brother's hand when he regained consciousness. He's deaf. He can't tell you stories. But he can sign. He signed one name, over and over, Captain Margaret Walsh. The woman you're about to recommend termination for. Pierce's face went the color of old plaster. I don't understand the relevance. You're about to. Holloway pulled out a folder, official, stamped, the kind of folder that made institutional power structures recognize they were standing on ground that wasn't theirs anymore. Citation for extraordinary heroism during combat operations in Baghdad. Performed 17 field surgeries under fire. Trained for enlisted medics in emergency procedures, including Specialist Garrett Hayes, who is currently in room 347 recovering from complications of wounds sustained in the line of duty. The compliance investigator looked up from her notes. The board president leaned forward. Pierce's jaw worked soundlessly, trying to form words that had nowhere to go. Captain Margaret Walsh, Holloway continued, reading from the official citation with the kind of precision that military ceremonies demanded, received the Silver Star for actions on March 14, 2009. She also received the Bronze Star for valor. 2 Purple Hearts for wounds sustained while providing emergency medical care in hostile territory. The door opened. A 2-star general walked in, Major General Ethan Cross, with insignia that made everyone else in the room stand without being asked. He was grey at the temples, the kind of calm that came from having survived things that would break smaller people. He crossed to the mahogany table, looked at the citation, looked at Pierce, and extended his hand to Holloway. "Where is she?" the general asked. "Room 347, Holloway said. The general nodded and turned to leave, then paused. He looked back at Pierce, and in that moment, the full weight of military command, not of armies, but of consequence, settled like a hand on Pierce's shoulder. Your medical privileges are suspended immediately. The hospital legal team is coordinating with federal investigators. We have 17 cases. 7 of them involved billing code manipulation tied to your login credentials. Offshore accounts. 17 cases over 4 years. 18 months of this, doctor. 18 months. Pierce's phone buzzed. Then again. Then again. His wife's lawyer. His attorney. A colleague stepping away. The network he'd activated was now a web cinching tight around his own throat. Security will escort you out, the general said, and there was something in his voice, not anger, but a kind of exhaustion that came from watching people forget what they were supposed to be. Don't make it difficult. The investigation expanded like wildfire through dry brush. $847,000 in inflated charges targeting veteran patients whose advocates were too busy with grief to fight bureaucracy. 18 fraudulent cases. Pierce's yacht seized by federal marshals. His country club membership revoked. His wife filed for divorce, taking the house in Tybee Island, filing her own statement that she'd warned him 3 times about the offshore accounts. The medical board hearing lasted for hours. His license was suspended pending criminal trial. 18 months later, a veterans advocate researching fraud patterns in military healthcare found Dr. Pierce teaching CPR certification at a community college, $14 an hour, unable to meet anyone's eyes. When a former resident from St. Michael's walked in for certification renewal, Pierce pretended not to recognize her. She pretended not to recognize him. They both understood, some falls are final. Some people don't climb back. But that was future. That was consequence playing out in slow, meticulous time. In the moment, Margaret walked into room 347 wearing a visitor badge because she wasn't reinstated as staff. She didn't need to be. The investigation was complete. She'd found what she was sent to find. Her commanding officer was already on secure line arranging her next posting. But first, this. The ranger sat up in his hospital bed, chest tube removed, color returned, eyes that had seen the worst of what humans could do now seeing something worth surviving for. His hands moved in ASL, *, you saved me twice. Baghdad and here. *. Margaret signed back, *, you took my place. You got hit doing my job. *. He shook his head with the certainty of someone who'd finally started to heal. *, you trained me to do the job. I did it. *. She reached into her jacket and pulled out the faded unit patch his sister had returned to her, the one she'd been carrying for 8 months sewn into her lining, next to her heart, the way soldiers carry the weight of the people they trained. She handed it to him. He took it, closed his fist around it, and signed with his other hand, *, thank you, Captain. *. Margaret allowed herself to smile, the first real one in 8 months, the kind of smile that comes from knowing the hard work was worth it, that the quiet person in the room had been the one holding everything together all along. Outside the window, Savannah's sun broke through morning clouds like an answer to a prayer nobody had spoken out loud. As she walked down the corridor past nurses who now knew exactly who she was, past the empty office that used to be Pierce's, past the security desk where her badge still didn't work, she thought about stethoscopes and combat knives, about the different ways to save a life, about soldiers who never stop serving even when the uniform changes to scrubs and cardigans and name tags that hide more than they reveal. Sometimes the bravest warriors carry stethoscopes, not guns. If you're settling in for a good story, you're in the right place. Hit like, subscribe, and tell us in the comments what time of day it is where you are. Let's get back to it.